The 1930s were a time of great change that saw many milestones that would come to define the decade. The Great Depression affected millions across America. The Graf Zeppelin completed a historic journey, and the New Deal ushered in an era of social programs we still use today. And pinball emerged as a popular new pastime, although it quickly drew the ire of New York City Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, who went to war with the Silverball because of its alleged ties to the underworld and illegal gambling. Today, we're taking a look at how pinball was banned in the United States because of the mob. But before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. And while you're at it, leave a comment and let us know what other unusual true crime topics you would like to hear about next. Okay, that weird history kid sure plays a mean pinball. From the flashing lights to the endorphin-triggering sound effects to the thrill of slapping your coins down on a machine to call next game, there's nothing quite like pinball. Pinball actually started out as an improved version of the French game, bagatelle. More like a variation of billiards, bagatelle involved hitting a ball around a small table with a stick. The ball would bounce around a series of bumpers and eventually landed in one of the holes. At one point in history, this was considered the bleeding edge of fun. Don't judge them too harshly. The Sega Game Gear was but a distant twinkle in a hedgehog's eye. Fast forward to 1871, when Montague Redgrave, an Englishman residing in Cincinnati, added his own tweaks to bagatelle to create an early version of what would eventually become pinball. With a name like Montague Redgrave, we hardly needed to tell you that he was British. Redgrave's modifications included making the game smaller, adding a plunger, and using small marbles rather than the standard ball. He called it improvements in bagatelle. Apparently, Redgrave's imagination did not extend to the world of catchy names. Nonetheless, his new version caught on and allowed bagatelle to become a countertop game. This led to the machine being used for gambling purposes and prompted further innovation through the next few decades. But Redgrave's game was all dependent on luck. Players released the ball, and from that point on, wherever it went was pretty much out of their control. And it lacked a key control feature that most of us immediately associate with pinball: flippers. In fact, flippers didn't show up until surprisingly late in pinball's history, but more on that in a bit. 5 decades later, an Ohio resident, a Youngstown carpenter named Arthur Paulin, created the game that would spawn the pinball craze in 1930. Paulin found an old board full of holes and nails in his barn. Because this was the Great Depression, he decided to turn that naily board into a gift for his daughter. After tinkering with it for a while, he cobbled together a bagatelle-like game. And that is when everything changed. Kids from around the neighborhood began lining up to play. So Paulin did what anyone would do in such a situation. He decided to charge a nickel per play. Hey, it was the Depression. Although, where did he think those kids were going to get a bunch of nickels? After some collaboration with folks around town, the game eventually had a coin slot and ball return installed. He called his invention Whiffle. Hey, he did better than Redgrave. That guy would have named it Ball and Hole Wood Board, or something. Once released in town, the game began making money and started selling around the country. Although it wasn't the first early pinball machine to be developed in the US, it was the first to be commercially sold. And it paved the way for what was to come later. Pinball quickly grew in popularity during the Great Depression. It offered cheap fun in a time when very little else did. Basically, you had pinball and stickball, and with stickball, you had to provide your own ball and stick. Due to a decent profit split of 50-50 in most cases, pinball also helped keep some businesses going. But the exciting new amusement gained a reputation as a gambling device. New York City's mayor and airport namesake, Fiorello LaGuardia, spent the early 1930s cracking down on gambling and slot machines in the city. LaGuardia eventually went on a crusade against pinball games, calling the machines a racket dominated by interests heavily tainted with criminality. Yeah, does it remind you of anything today? I'm looking at you, putt-putt arcades. LaGuardia successfully had pinball declared an illegal game of chance. And just like that, pinball was banned in New York City by 1940. So what was LaGuardia's problem with pinball anyway? Was he just lousy at it? Well, as a direct result of LaGuardia's crackdown on gambling, many gamblers turned to pinball to satisfy their desire to make wagers and bets, and generally scratch that gambling itch. Per Edward Trapinski's Special When Lit, the pinball manufacturers likely facilitated this, leading to them becoming associated with gambling and vice. The term pinball didn't even exist until a Kentucky reporter coined the term to cover a story about gambling machines. But there was another reason pinball machines were linked to gambling and organized crime. One of the main reasons pinball became associated with mob control was due to the most popular manufacturers being located in Chicago. Whereas modern-day Chicago is associated with the Bulls and deep dish pizza, at the time Chicago was known for organized crime. Although in fairness, deep dish pizza is a form of organized crime. But beyond the geographic connection, there was some evidence the mafia had their hands in pinball machines as well. Pinball was a great income source at a time when money was hard to come by. Pinball wasn't easy to win. Remember, flippers still hadn't been invented yet, so each game was at the mercy of the god of amusement machines. Consequently, whichever business owned a pinball machine could essentially rake in losers' money as they continued to feed their coins to the game. And with the end of Prohibition, members of the mob likely did control some of the pinball, whether it was through gambling or protection rackets. As a result of the mob connection, many churches and law enforcement agencies began to publicly condemn pinball. Pinball was ruled a game of chance, not a game of skill, in a 1935 court case, putting some weight behind LaGuardia's assertions that it was a form of gambling. And while Mayor Frowny Stormcloud was doing his best to ruin everyone's fun, he wasn't entirely wrong about pinball. Since flippers didn't exist yet, players basically just propelled the ball with the plunger, and then Lady Luck took care of the rest. And since many pinball machines were single-play machines with money involved, it did look suspiciously like gambling. One machine, called Rocket, even had a payout for players who hit high scores. That's just a slot machine, right, fellas? We can all agree on that one, right? Rocket came with a flyer explaining to users that it could be operated in open or closed territory, which meant its payout function could be toggled on or off. In other words, it could be switched back and forth between a novelty game and a game of chance. This probably contributed to the perception of pinball games as gambling machines. According to pinball enthusiast Jim West, players might have perceived games like Rocket to be more fair than a standard slot machine. According to this concern, store owners lowered the price of pinball from a nickel to a penny during school hours. Because the best gambling addicts start young. Furthermore, some stores would hand out prizes in the form of packs of cigarettes and even firearms to people who achieved a certain high score. That's right. In an alternate universe, landing a high score on the Waterworld pinball machine could have come with a pack of smokes and a free gun. We truly are living in the worst timeline. Organized crime saw opportunity in pinball as Prohibition came to an end. It was kind of like portfolio diversification. Around this time, a distributor named Ray Maloney created a new machine called Ballyhoo. The game was a success, prompting him to rename his manufacturing company Bally. You've probably seen that name stamped on the sides of several pinball machines to this day. Maloney and his company Bally played on the concept of pinball as a gambling machine, and most sources say he developed ties to the mafia. Developments like these made LaGuardia furious, because he believed it encouraged truancy and bad behavior. He was worried about the kids falling under the influence of the insidious game. Among other things, he predicted they would start ditching school to play arcade games. Oh well, I guess they do end up doing that. Okay, the guy may have been a sourpuss, but he wasn't exactly wrong. He was like the Nostradamus of coin-operated gaming. Speaking of those kids, every decade or so, America likes to have a good old-fashioned moral panic over something that's poisoning the minds of children.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
Rock and roll, Dungeons and Dragons, violent video games, and, I don't know, Baywatch probably, all have shared this dubious honor. But in the 1930s and 40s, the culprit responsible for corrupting the youth was pinball. Since pinball was essentially a game of chance, still no flippers at this point, LaGuardia felt the game could be addictive and used for gambling. He considered the games to be slight variations of slot machines, because they pretty much were, and he sought to eliminate their influence entirely. For LaGuardia, who had a history of crusading against any form of gambling whatsoever, the opportunity to defeat pinball was compelling. He made it his mission to seize the offending machines and clean up the town. He posed for photos with police who were destroying machines. Can't really hold that against him. It's a prime selfie opportunity. And there's even a famous photo of him holding a sledgehammer, smashing pinball machines all around him like Peter Gabriel in a protection racket. Just because LaGuardia banned pinball in the city didn't mean pinball manufacturers were just going to sit there and take it. Not when there were nickels to be made. 4 different pinball manufacturers brought forth a lawsuit against the crackdown in 1948. It made it all the way to the New York Supreme Court. As the hearing unfolded, the district attorney of Kings County sought to bring damning evidence against the pinball industry. He claimed the notorious organized crime outfit, Murder, Inc., had a connection to pinball, alleging that the gang would use the machines as part of their protection and shakedown schemes. According to Michael Scheiss, the founder of the Pacific Pinball Museum in Alameda, California, the Mafia gave pinball manufacturers startup funds throughout the 1930s, ostensibly to invest in pinball machines after slot machines were outlawed. In his book Small Time, author Russell Shapiro discusses his family's involvement with pinball and the mob. He wrote, "The beauty of pinball to the mob was that since coins you put in didn't correspond with a quantifiable product like cigarettes or candy, it was impossible to track the machine's earnings. The high-tech fun of the game, plus the possibility of beating it for cash, made them addictive. In other words, they were perfect little money laundering machines, and the novelty and addictive nature of the game kept people coming back for more." 2 New Yorkers, Sidney Turner and Sadie Billett, used their pinball machines for gambling. They went to court over it, paid a fine of $50, and lost their city-issued licenses, which stipulated that the holder was only permitted to operate pinball machines for amusement purposes. Read, not for gambling. Eventually, events like these steadily drove pinball underground. Prohibition-style raids on pinball forced it to go further underground, where it remained for the next few decades. The United States entered World War II after the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, and the need for scrap metal around the country led to some major changes in daily life. It also drastically changed public opinion about pinball machines. The Salvage for Victory campaign compelled Americans to turn in any scrap metal they could find to help the war effort. And pinball is like 90% scrap metal. It was a game Arthur Paulin first built out of literal junk. LaGuardia saw an opportunity to further his attack on pinball, seizing the machines for their scrap metal. 2,500 of the 3,000 machines he confiscated equated to about 1 ton of metal after he took his sledgehammer to them. The pinball ban continued for a long time afterward, but was eventually overturned. It seems strange, but pinball was banned in New York City until 1976, 8 years after Pinball Wizard was bouncing around the Billboard Hot 100. In other words, the game was fairly mainstream at that point, which makes its banned status all the more surprising. Even more surprising, the addition of the now ubiquitous flipper had a lot to do with getting the ban lifted. Before flippers came about, people rocked and tilted the machines to make the ball go their way. If we're being really honest, people still do that. Flippers didn't do away with the inherent need to shake your way to a high score. That's why pinball tables have a tilt function that voids a player's ball if they get too feisty. The point is, there wasn't any skill required, giving pinball the designation of a game of chance instead of a game of skill. The flipper's invention changed that. Although LaGuardia had a point about some of the bad actors using pinball to circumvent gambling restrictions, flippers changed the game entirely. Giving players the ability to control the ball's movements around the table racked up more points in the skill category than the chance category, meaning it could no longer be considered the same as a slot machine. At least that's what Roger Sharp, a magazine editor in his mid-20s, aimed to convince the courts. So what changed the city's mind about the game? According to Pinball Wizards by Adam Rubin, Sharp was a pinball enthusiast who regularly wrote about the game for several publications. Eventually, he stumbled upon a plan to help turn over the ban. Since games of skill were exempt from the gambling bans, Sharp found a way to prove pinball fit into that category. When he testified to the city council, he offered to demonstrate that pinball was a game of skill with the machine El Dorado. But the councilman pulled a gotcha move worthy of the most thrilling John Grisham courtroom drama and had him play a table called Bank Shot instead. Sharp insisted the last-minute switch wasn't a problem. He told them he could expertly drop his ball into the game's middle slot, thus proving that pinball depended more on skill than random chance. He pulled back the plunger and let the ball fly, then worked the flippers until the ball dropped into the middle slot, exactly like he'd said. After seeing this skillful display, the city council decided to overturn the ban on pinball, making it legal once again in the Big Apple. For Sharp, this represented a victory for pinball enthusiasts everywhere. But the truth was, he'd been bluffing about making the shot. He knew it theoretically could be done, but he had no idea if he could actually pull it off. It was like Babe Ruth calling a shot, if the Babe were a line cook making wagers on an Addams Family table at his uncle's pizzeria. So what do you think? Is pinball just a glorified slot machine or a challenging game of skill? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're at it, check out these other videos from our weird history.